In this video, we reflect on the state of division and partisanship in the US, and we review the history of how we ended up here. It's both surprising how long a journey it's been and kind of shocking how deliberate and powerful have been the techniques that made it happen. Let's dive in. According to the Pew Research Center, the share of Americans who express consistently partisan opinions has doubled over the last 2 decades from 10% to 21%. Ideological thinking is now much more lined up with political partisanship than in the past. As a result, the overlap between the two parties has diminished. Today, 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrat, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. And it won't have escaped your notice that partisan animosity has accordingly gone up. In each party, the share with a highly negative view of the opposing party has more than doubled since 1994. The most passionate partisans believe the opposing party's policies, quote, are so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being. The partisans of today get their information from different sources to each other. They not only argue the merits of policy proposals, but they angrily dispute the facts and the data themselves. We look at the situation and conclude that not only can we not agree on what to do, we can't even agree on what constitutes reality. And we kind of assume that's a new phenomenon, but in fact the roots run deep. This is a discussion that's been going on for 100 years. One person who covered a lot of it is Jill Lepore in her book on the history of the US, These Truths. I've drawn significant information for this video from her writing in that book and in the New Yorker magazine. Going back to 1925, when Tennessee became the first US state to ban the teaching of evolution, there was a court case which came to be seen as the fight between science and knowledge, majority opinion and faith, or alternatively reason versus fundamentalism. The case was lost, and the writer Walter Lippmann realised that this was an argument that had huge implications for American democracy. The defence had asked a question that had originally been framed by Thomas Jefferson, and it was this: what right has a little irresponsible oligarchy of self-styled intellectuals to demand control of the schools of the United States, in which 25 million of children are being educated at an annual expense of tens of billions of dollars? Lippmann saw the implications. If a majority of voters decided that Charles Darwin was wrong and that evolution shouldn't be taught in schools, well, what was everyone else supposed to do? If evolution was a strong and plausible and important theory of how change occurs in nature, how could the minority of people who found the theory persuasive even begin to argue with the majority, which in a generation would consist of people who had been taught something completely different? He concluded that ultimately a majority of people were not fans of reason. In fact, they hated it, saw it as an alternative religion. And if the common people hate reason, he said, there's no way a government of the people can protect the freedom of thought. The person of faith cannot accept reason as the arbiter of truth without giving up faith. The person of reason cannot accept that truth lies outside the realm of reason. The citizens being unable to agree on basic matters of fact, they cannot agree on how to educate their children together. This is the propagandist's opportunity, Lippmann wrote. With enough money and the tools of mass communication deployed efficiently, the propagandist can turn a political majority into a truth. And well before he wrote that, the US had already seen the power of propagandists with the first political consulting firm in history, Campaigns Inc. Campaigns Inc. was founded in 1933 by Clem Whitaker and Leon Baxter, and they specialised in winning campaigns any way they had to. Upton Sinclair dubbed them the Lie Factory when he was detailing how he'd lost his election because of their work for his opponent. Sinclair, as an author, had written a number of books. Whitaker and Baxter scoured everything he'd ever written to find quotes that could be taken out of context. They arranged for a quote to run every day in a box on the front of the LA Times. It included quotes like, "Sinclair on marriage. The sanctity of marriage. I have had such a belief, I have it no longer." Now, this was actually a quote from a character in one of his novels, but it was represented as though it was spoken by Sinclair himself. Campaigns Inc. defined the rulebook for how you could influence the public to support a political candidate or a proposition. Never explain anything. The more you have to explain, Whitaker said, the more difficult it is to win support. Say the same thing over and over again, repetition. We assume we have to get a voter's attention 7 times to make a sale, Whitaker said. Subtlety is your enemy. Words that lean on the mind are no good, according to Baxter. They must dent it. Simplify, simplify, simplify. A wall goes up, Whitaker warned, when you try to make Mr. and Mrs. Average American Citizen work or think. And most relevantly, fan the flames. We need more partisanship in this country, Whitaker said. Never shy from controversy. Instead, win the controversy. The average American doesn't want to be educated, but there are 2 ways you can interest him in a campaign, and only 2 that we have ever found successful. You can put on a fight. He likes a good hot battle with no punches pulled, or you can put on a show. They were the ancestors of all the modern writers on persuasion. The power of some of these principles have been shown time and time again. In politics, it was putting on a fight that worked most obviously, and if there wasn't an obvious opponent, Campaigns Inc. wasn't above inventing one. Then there was another major revolution going on, pulling in the same vein. George Gallup had started conducting polls in the 1930s and had demonstrated that the more emotional the issue at hand, the more likely the voters were to turn up at the polls. Stoking outrage, therefore, became the business model of the political strategist. And the issues that lent themselves most to the task were the ones that have become most familiar today. If you look at the most powerful moral and emotional issues that clearly define the gaping divide between the 2 political parties in the US, you'd think that they must have been a defining part of their political identity for all of their history. They are such a clear and massively ingrained part of their identity. But if you consider what's supposed to make left or right politics, there's nothing inherent in issues like abortion or gun control that is necessarily belonging to one or the other. If you throw in others, such as equal rights for women and other groups, and issues such as climate change, it's the same. Nothing inherently partisan in the issues themselves. So how did we end up here? Well, we ended up here because political strategists followed their own incentives. And in the same way that social media companies today push us further and further to the extremes, so too then did the political campaigns. What did you want to do if you were running a political campaign? You wanted to clearly define yourself from the other side, for sure, and to do so in a way that would appeal deeply and powerfully to your own side, a gut-level emotional appeal, an issue that your side came to view as involving fundamental rights. And it also helps if you can ramp up fear of consequences from the other side winning. So an issue that can never be resolved just by a single piece of legislation, where you can always present the dangers of the other side taking control because of the havoc they may wreak on the progress that you've made to date. In other words, those fundamental rights are vulnerable and must be protected from the other side. That isn't a natural state of being. It was deliberately created. Before the 1970s, the divisions on these sorts of issues did not fall along party lines. That's how it is in the UK right now on most of these issues. Things like abortion and the death penalty is another one, seen as conscience issues. MPs are free to vote accordingly, with the political parties rarely taking a specific position. So you had a situation where the Republicans had a track record of offering more support to equal rights and family planning than Democrats. Planned Parenthood, founded by Margaret Sanger in 1916, forced her out of her own organisation eventually because it objected to her feminist positions. Its leaders were both Republican and Democrat, but more of the former. So Richard Nixon had supported legislation on abortion. But as the ruling on Roe v. Wade approached, his advisor saw political opportunity. In 1971, Pat Buchanan told Nixon that abortion was a rising issue and a gut issue with Catholics, suggested that his prospects for re-election would be boosted if the president should publicly take his stand against abortion as offensive to his own moral principles. And a week later he did just that, ignoring those of his supporters who complained about the shift. This happened side by side with a conservative takeover generally within the Republican Party, driven by the political strategists. It took time, only completed under Reagan in the late 1980s. Up until that point, Republicans were more pro-choice than Democrats. But there was an ideological sorting process that then took place. Jill Lepore described it like this. In the 1970s, when Republicans became more conservative, polarization surged. The migration of Southern Democrats to the GOP explains only about a third of this shift. Much of it is better understood as a consequence of the politicization of abortion. Between 1978 and 1984, pro-life Democrats and pro-choice Republicans were purged from their parties. While conservatives thought of themselves as perfecting targeted political messaging through emerging technologies, and liberals believed that they were advancing identity politics, together they amounted to the same thing. A more atomized and enraged electorate conveniently reached through computer-generated mailing and telephone lists. This was pre-internet, of course, when feeding outrage took more manual labour than it does today. The gun side of the equation started with gun ownership and gun safety legislation. Paul Weyrich, conservative strategist and a founder of the Heritage Foundation, declared, "It is a war of ideology, it's a war of ideas, and it's a war about our way of life. And it has to be fought with the same intensity, I think, and dedication as you would fight a shooting war." In the 1960s, it was a matter of policy and pragmatism. By the end of the century, it was life and death. As Jill Lepore put it in These Truths, either abortion was murder and guns meant freedom, or guns meant murder and abortion meant freedom. How this sorted came to depend upon party affiliation. A huge amount of work had to go into turning these into the powerful issues that they became. On gun ownership, for instance, this had neither been a partisan issue, nor was it one that excited a huge amount of debate. The National Rifle Association, founded in 1871, had campaigned for gun safety measures in the 1920s. Its motto used to be firearms safety education, marksmanship training, shooting for recreation. The NRA supported a ban on mail-order gun sales in 1963. It supported the 1968 Gun Control Act, passed after the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. It was all about what sort of reasonable regulations the sportsmen of America could live with. Republicans were as likely as Democrats to support gun control measures, and that included Ronald Reagan as governor of California. Nobody talks about the Constitution at that point. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, that was widely understood as a product of its time when there was no standing federal army and all the states depended on citizens' militias for their defence. One of the first people to actually start drawing the link was actually Malcolm X, shortly before his death. The argument that the Constitution guaranteed the right to own a gun became a founding principle of the Black Panther Party, and then in response in the 1970s began to form the argument of a growing backlash. The idea became the official position of the NRA. It gained strength within a context of growing fears around patterns of immigration and a growing white power movement. In 1975, the NRA created the lobbying arm, the Institute for Legislative Action, and there was an organisational coup within the NRA, with Bronson Carter taking over from the old leadership and making the endorsement of Reagan the first political endorsement the organisation had ever given. Reagan changed his position to become fully supportive of gun rights, even after he himself had been shot. So it became another one of those issues where people saw the other side getting their way as being a vulnerability. And that vulnerability, the power of issues to motivate people by fear, It really comes from the weak constitutional foundations that each of the issues rests on. Neither issue could have been anticipated in its current form by the founders, so creating constitutional justification either way involves considerable contortions. Now, the Conservative position on guns became important to the party because of the role it could play in a political strategy to take over the judiciary and to establish a new approach to interpreting the Constitution. This took the shape of the founding of the Federalist Society, the development of the approach to the Constitution known as originalism, and the reinterpretation of the Second Amendment. In 1982, a Senate committee report was produced making the argument that the Second Amendment had been misinterpreted for nearly 2 centuries. It suggested that they had uncovered long-lost proof that the Second Amendment to the Constitution was intended as an individual right of the American citizen to keep and carry arms in a peaceful manner for the protection of himself, his family, and his freedoms. This was a reaction against what had been increasingly creative ways that the courts had found to find liberal principles in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution. The originalists said that this was riding roughshod over the original intent of the founders, and you had to stick to the letter and the original purpose. Historians declared the originalists' reading of the Second Amendment as absurd. One, Gary Wills, said that the Second Amendment had everything to do with common defence and nothing to do with hunting. One does not, he said, bear arms against a rabbit. Nevertheless, originalism became the official policy of the Reagan Justice Department, and the same for his various Republican successors, including most recently President Trump, as we saw in the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And the gun debate then underwent the transformation we've seen on all of these issues, becoming irrational and extreme on both sides. As Jill Lepore put it, liberals often reacted hysterically to conservative gun rights arguments and called for impossible-to-pass gun control measures, whose consequences the NRA delightedly exaggerated. Under these circumstances, gun owners grew genuinely fearful that the federal government intended to seize their guns. In 1986, Congress repealed parts of the Gun Control Act, invoking the new interpretation, or should that be allegedly old interpretation, of the Second Amendment. In 1991, Warren Burger called the new interpretation of the Second Amendment one of the greatest pieces of fraud on the American public by special interest groups. But it was both the action and the reaction that combined together to transform the issue into an emotionally charged matter of constitutionally guaranteed individual right that had the power to drive people to the polls at election time. So that was the guns part. Science entered the partisan arena during the Reagan era. And this wasn't a case of an emotional issue that would motivate the voters. It was more an inconvenient argument that was presented as a barrier to an important partisan priority. Specifically, Reagan wanted to move towards the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a defensive shield that could theoretically protect the US from a nuclear attack, enabling it to fight what he described as a winnable nuclear war. Up until that point, the massive arsenals of the nuclear powers had created the received wisdom that it was all about mutually assured destruction. The launch of an attack would be an act of suicide by whoever initiated it because of the massive retaliation that would follow. But SDI promised an unbalancing of that assurance. At that point, Carl Sagan, who was a hugely popular public figure, became the face of some scientific work that suggested even a limited nuclear war could bring about the end of all life on the planet by creating a nuclear winter. Critics attacked Sagan on various fronts because of the implications that such an argument would have. The physicist Edward Teller attacked Sagan in the scientific journal Nature. Highly speculative theories of worldwide destruction, even the end of life on Earth, used as a call for a particular kind of political action, serve neither the good reputation of science nor dispassionate political thought. A number of environmental scientists challenged the science behind nuclear winter, pointing out that its conclusions were mostly predictions based on models and that the science was therefore not certain. Yes, the same arguments have been happening over and over for quite a long time. But this was the time when it started to shift. when conservatives first started to extend their long-standing critique of liberal bias of the arts and the media to science. It wasn't a smooth transition, but ultimately prominent critics of a nuclear winter would go on to become prominent critics of climate science and climate change. The detail of how all that happened would probably take a video all of its own. There were other factors then that fed the polarization. In 1987, the Reagan administration repealed the Fairness Doctrine, which required that broadcasters had an obligation to present opposing points of view. That made it possible for some new partisan channels, starting with a new kind of conservative talk radio. It enabled a more powerful medium for that constant drift of American citizens into lanes where they only had to be exposed to increasingly extreme versions of that which they already believed. This was a process that became enabled even more with the advent of social media, of course, and, as we've seen very recently, the control of what voices can be heard and by whom has become a major battleground. And all of this has come to be defined as the abolition of actual truth and the embrace by both sides of relative truth. The ongoing triumph of that early discussion from 1925 in the court case about whether schools had to teach Darwin or not. Alan Bloom, writing in 1987 in The Closing of the American Mind, declared about how things had ended up. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering his university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. And Todd Gitlin, sociologist and commentator, bemoaned the emerging situation back in 1995, a quarter of a century ago. The left, which once stood for universal values, seems to speak today for select identities, while the right, long associated with privileged interests, claims to defend the common good. So the current grounds for the polarization of America has been a work in progress for a very long time. It's not just because of social media algorithms, although they have ensured that more people get pushed to the extremes, with the effect that we saw right at the start of the video. And that matters because according to that Pew research, the majority, those who are not political activists, still tend towards the centre, towards tolerance, non-hysteria. They don't see either party as a threat to the nation. They believe politicians should compromise more and resolve disputes rather than fighting for all or nothing. But there's a steady push. Gradually, a few more and a few more get eased on the journey towards the edges, where the outrage lives, where the actions of opponents are always a sign of creeping fascism, where no good people exist on the other side and no bad people on your own side, and so on and so on. Can such a long-standing embedded process of 100 years be reversed? And if not, where does it end? It feels as though things can't get much more polarised than they are now. So does that mean the end is close? And does it end by the partisan bubble bursting and people turning against it, the relentless negative mindset? Or does it end up in a formal split? Two nations. The first country that divided not on ethnic or religious identities, but on ideological ones. No doubt someone will tell me that it wouldn't be the first one at all. Now, obviously, I make my pitch on this channel for activists to break out of their bubble, to understand and recognise the techniques being used to manipulate them, and to seek out a better grounded sense of reality, where an understanding of the facts is supported by evidence, and ideas are robustly tested by seeking out the best arguments for and the best arguments against, argued openly and in good faith. There is no dynamic pushing that into the mainstream right now. Remains a minority sport. Indeed, even that so-called elite of scientists who stood for Darwin being taught in schools in 1925, the modern version shows regularly that they're not above buying into the political positions themselves. So however this is going to play out, it's going to do so pretty much with people following the incentives they see in front of them wherever they lead. Good people in the centre should at least be ready to pick up the pieces should it lead to as dark a place as it sometimes threatens to do.